more time from our special guests. So I would like to initiate the debate. As I've already said, the difference between the system or the state in Slovak Republic and the Netherlands and its judicial systems it's pretty obvious. Lousewies, how is it possible that there is an impressive 80% trust rating in judiciary and police forces among survey respondents in last years?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jan. Thank you very much for inviting me. We always like to cooperate with other TI chapters on this, and I was a member of the European Parliament, and before that, working on the accession of Slovakia to the European Union. So I always have a special affection for, the countries that recently joined, because it's just one of those processes where you see the economy developing, and then the rule of law developments, and then sometimes, of course, there can be a backlash as well. And I think the question you pose is a crucial one, but I'm going to immediately say I don't have like an immediate answer to that, but it's an important debate to have. So we thought that because of a recent scandal that we had, which is called the child benefit scandal, where also the courts were not really on the side of the citizens, but more on the side of the government, that there would be more of a decrease of the trust in the judiciary. But this was not the case. And I think traditionally the Netherlands has been a very high trust society. There's a high level of transparency. There's a high level of cooperation. But that is something that is eroding. It's something that we are actually concerned about. It's not really the topic of the conversation today, but I don't want to create the impression that we are really good and we have everything to teach everyone else, because we have our own challenges as well. And I think one of the big challenges we have right now is that the political elite is very close to businesses. And in a way, that means that they have the lowest level of trust. And by default, people do trust the police, and they do trust the judiciary. They also trust very often the media. And I think it's interesting to see that the trust is so high, especially in the judiciary, and it's something that that the judiciary has actually consistently had for a long time in the Netherlands. So one of the things that I was looking at is why is this? And we looked at this point, Jan. We were looking at in the preparation of well, how do they communicate? How does the judiciary communicate? And what's interesting is that judges do not speak directly to the citizens, because this is something that could be confusing, because there's the judgment and there's an actual result of what they say. But if you then start to go to give interviews or go to TV shows or something like that, it could be slightly different from the actual legal context, and that could be confusing. So judges speak through their judgment only. However, because those judgments are extraordinarily complex and people don't understand what they mean or the context, they have appointed a special press officer, but the press officer is also a judge. So it's not a spin doctor or someone who's really good at explaining things. It is a judge who then is qualified to be what we call a press judge. And I don't know if this institution exists in Slovakia or in other countries, but it's the judge which makes the translation from the complicated legal issue at hand to the media. And in that way, you can see that there's a lot of news about press judgments, but also that they tend to be quite nuanced. They're not simplistic, like the guy is a bad guy, he's a murderer, but because of these circumstances, because of this, because of that. So it explains it a lot. And I've always grown up with, this, it's in the news all the time. You read about it, you see it on TV. The actual judgment, the TV cameras are allowed to be there. And the judge will explain in as normal language as possible, this is the verdict for this and this reason. Of course, the suspects are never allowed to be in the picture in the media, and also never with last names in the press. So there's the anonymity of the suspects is always protected. And also in a lot of the cases, unless there's businesses, but on the other cases, always Mr. X and Mr. Y, Mrs. Z. So there's a lot of anonymity. So I think there's that basic protections that you would have are very much in place. And it's interesting because, you know, your question actually, you know, it stimulated me to think about it. Well, why do I trust the judiciary? And I think this has a lot to do with it. They communicate very openly. They communicate in a way that people can understand, but there's no confusion between what's in the judgment and what the judges say, because the judges don't talk about their own judgment. The judgment speaks for itself, but there is the press judge who then tries to explain it in a normal way, and especially why it's relevant in that particular case, because judgments are complicated. I think that kind of brings it together. But I don't want to create the impression that you know, that everything is perfect in Holland by any stretch of the imagination. And we also have increased polarization and a larger group of people who feel excluded. I think, you know, the Corona crisis made people very afraid, or even more afraid than you already have with digitalization and globalization and things. And that we have a group of people who demonstrate a lot, who don't trust the government, who don't accept the sovereignty of the government in many ways. It's still a small group, but they can be quite extreme. So it's not something which is a given. And I think the one thing I always realize, especially when working, you know, with other transparency chapters and traveling around the world, is that trust is something so valuable. And in Holland, we have an expression which is trust comes by foot, but it leaves on a horse. So, you know, it's really hard to build trust, but it's easy, very easy to lose it. And I think, you know, that is something that we have to see, that, you know, building trust is like building a you know, democracy, building the rule of law. It comes with many small steps, but you can lose it really quickly by getting things wrong.
Thank you very much for this opening speech. There is plenty of points that I would like to build on, but one of them is that the trust is built like continuously, that it's some kind of development. And we can see that on the research, on the public opinion polls, also in Netherlands. So you said that Slovakia is one of the new member states in EU, but actually there's fun situation that I asked one of my students today, that you remember when Slovakia joined in EU in 2004, and she said, like, I wasn't even born there. So we are not that new. The question is, how could we get on the track to at least start building trust? Because from my perspective, we are just on the opposite side, that we had it higher and we are decreasing.
Yeah, so it's very complex. What it always is an interplay with business integrity, public integrity, and an integrity culture throughout the society. And I mean, these not coincidentally are also the strategic priorities of Transparency International Netherlands. So what we've seen when it comes to business integrity and the interplay between business and politics is there's too much intertwining between the two. It's much easier for a big company to get things done than it is for an individual citizen. And that unbalance, that really feeds mistrust, because after all, you know, when you are too late with your taxes, you get a fine as a citizen, or if you break the law in any way. But then big companies seem to be able to get away with all kinds of things, whether it's pollution, whether it's not following different kind of laws. They get tax subsidies, they get grants, they don't even have to pay their full energy bill. So there's many ways in which companies seem to be getting a much easier time, much more support from the government, financial, legal, through access, than individuals. And that is something which can really undermine trust. And so among the things that we've set up is we want to really make it more transparent, like who lobbies the government. A lot of former politicians become lobbyists, 40% in Holland. And so luckily we have very independent media, and so they expose these things every single time that it happens. But on the recent legislation when it comes to gambling, so we've legalized gambling in the Netherlands. we saw that the gambling companies, the casinos, had much more access to the legislative process than, for example, the addiction prevention, the scientific research, the addiction experts. And one of the reasons was because the casinos, they hired lobbyists, and those lobbyists were former members of parliament and former member of the government. So big money buys you access to the process, and that kind of thing is very bad for trust. So among the things we're working on is making things like that transparent through a lobby register, making sure there's rules about cooling off period. So we translate kind of our bigger goal into kind of bite-sized chunks where either we need legislation or we need to have legislation to be applied. But mostly what we want, so it's laws, applying the laws, but also this mindset. And this is something where public pressure, I think, comes in very handy. And sadly, in Holland, usually things have to go wrong before you can get the public pressure to come. So it takes a scandal, it takes an outrage for things to change. And I think a recent example we had is that the Minister of Infrastructure became a lobbyist for the Dutch energy sector. So, Shell, BP, Exxon, and Gazprom was still a member then. This was, right before the invasion. But she still sat in on the ministerial meetings when she was already knew that she was going to get this job. And the Prime Minister thought this was fine. But this caused such an outrage when it became public that now we're finally getting a law which will require former ministers who become lobbyists to get permission. It's not what we want. We want a mandatory cooling off period, but you take the scandal, you make it into law, and then we take it from there. But it's many, many steps that it takes, and every time it goes wrong, it just confirms to the citizens, oh yeah, you see, they organize it for themselves. They get a nice cushy job. They will be making lots of money, but they don't, the citizens don't have that kind of access.
Samuel, we have plenty of institutional things that Lousewies was speaking about. For instance, we have plenty of transparency in our judicial system. We have plenty of scandals as well. So how is it possible that the trust in Slovakia is one of the lowest? And we can also see the results from the recent comparative report. And among EU states, Slovak courts deal with one of the highest amount of agenda, but on the other hand, they are among top also in the speed of procedure, or in the top 10 or something like that. So how is it possible that the trust or distrust in Slovak judicial system is at such a high level?
Thanks for the question, and thanks to Lousewies for all the great points you made, because there's so much to build on. To answer your question, I think there are several factors that are causing the low trust in the Slovak judiciary. Some of them are, let's say, cultural, so they're not necessarily the court's fault. What we observe in data is that post-communist countries, or these new member states, EU member states countries, they generally have lower trust in institutions, which seems to be the effect of post-communism. Some explain it as the effect that during the communism, there was this dichotomy, people versus the state. So they do not really trust the state as somebody who necessarily is trying to protect the citizens' interest. So this is one factor that in graphs, it seems that it is decreasing trust in institutions somewhere between 5 to 10%. So that's one thing. The other is that there is the institutional performance, for instance, in Slovakia is generally lower. You mentioned that courts actually have many incoming cases, but a lot of resolved cases, and speed of procedures is fairly high. This is something that is not necessarily objective in any way, or cannot be objectively measured in any way, especially how people feel about it, because people do not necessarily care that we are, even if we were the fastest judiciary in the European Union, it is how it is perceived and how they feel. That the thing is that what is measured in these reports is all the cases, whereas all the cases that they are complicated in very differentiated way. And people's experiences are that maybe simple cases, let's say divorces, when there is no necessary contention, are resolved fast. But what takes long are all the complicated cases. So that shared experience is not necessarily that it is functioning properly. The second thing is that judiciary is perceived as corrupt. I think Slovakia was perceived as third most corrupt among European countries. Once again, this is caused by the effect of post-communism, but also how the culture operates in the country, where corruption to a large extent is expected of the institutions. So people do expect that people in power are more or less corrupt, or at least are open to some kinds of corruption. We are not necessarily talking about some large grand corruption, but we are talking about petty corruption and corruption that deals with, for instance, speed of procedures and obstructions that can be made in cases. So this is what people feel that there is present there. And there is that cultural thing, on the other hand, which I think is correct. And what we observe also from the academic point of view is that mindset that was mentioned, what we see in judiciary especially, but I think in other state institutions as well, is that those who are holding the power, or let me put it differently, we established formal institutions that should, for instance, secure judicial independence, but judges do not necessarily value independence in the same manner as they value it in Western countries. So they perceive independence as something that should protect them from basically any criticism, any accountability attempts, but not something that is in place to secure the judiciary will resolve cases independently based on facts only, and without any disclosed or undisclosed biases. Those go well beyond corruption, but even, let's say, gender or racial biases that are, or it is rumored that they are very much present in the Slovak judiciary. So these are the things that I think contribute most to the low trust in the judiciary. And there is also a specific Slovak story that at least since 2006, judiciary has been, or the rule of law has been a very salient topic in political arena in Slovakia. In 2006, Štefan Harabin became Minister of Justice, and then in 2009, directly from the position of Minister of Justice, he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and Chairman of the Judicial Council. Plus, it is a person with a very, let's say, controversial past, nominated by a party with semi-authoritarian tendencies. That was the Mečiar's movement for democratic Slovakia. And since then, judiciary has been openly divided, openly in conflict between, let's say, more conservative and more, or tendencies towards more open judiciary. And I think that this fact that the judiciary is divided, that it is divided on a substantial issue that deals with culture and deals with the issue how judiciary is presented to the public, also is something that decreases trust of the public towards the judiciary. Because what the public sees is that judiciary is not necessarily clear in its function in the society and has no clear view of how the judiciary should operate. Plus, then there are corruption cases and the way how the judiciary handled those corruption cases, which was with great hesitance and with attempts to be as little accountable as possible. And I think these are all things that resonate with the public, which sees that judiciary is not necessarily there to serve them as citizens, but is there probably more to serve the judiciary itself. And this is not something that is sitting well with the public.
Yeah, well, what's the cure? Where can we find some solutions? Because plenty of things you were speaking of are of historical reasons. For instance, it's 2023, so the communist era has ended like 30 years ago. That's the first point. Another thing is that since I'm here in TI Slovakia, I remember that our narrative was that we need to fight against grand corruption to improve this trust in public sphere. Obviously, when you look at the corruption cases in the last 3 years, the situation has changed. It has changed significantly. If you look at our outputs concerning the work of district court judges and their outputs, the situation is changing in a good sense, or in a good way, in a good, yeah, you understand what I mean. So there is improvement. Therefore, what's the solution for all this distrust?
It's a difficult question, and for instance, Netherlands have always been a somewhat puzzle for me, because the institutional trust there, but not only there, but in few other countries, has been generally high across institutions. This is some kind of vicious cycle or circle, I think, because if you have a judiciary that people do not trust, then, or not only judiciary, but all the repressive organs in the state, police and prosecution, people are not going to trust the results of such prosecution if they do not trust the institution. In social science terms, it is called diffuse and specific support. Diffuse support is the support that is attributed to institutions in general, and specific support is the support that people have for specific decisions of the institutions. If diffuse support, if the support for institutions is low, then support for individual decisions or individual cases is also going to be a bit lower than it should be. Maybe it wouldn't be the case, but this is caused by the, I guess, the nature of political conflict in Slovakia, which is currently as divided as it has probably never been before, and it was always a highly polarized country politically. So there are two coexisting, or at least two coexisting narratives of what is justice and how justice should be applied, and with that, institutions cannot necessarily deal with, because what we observe is that people do not trust the institutional design, even though I think that institutional design is working in this way, I would say even as good as it can, because we have whatever, if you have problematic police, if you have problematic prosecution, which certainly may be the case, then it gets to the courts, and it is not decided in one instance only. So you have several remedies where these processes can be turned around. Yet people do not trust this, and this goes to something else. This goes probably to the ability of people to properly understand the process, and to some extent, I still think that it goes to those unfortunate communist legacies, because, as I said, they have distrust towards state institutions. They do perceive state institutions as instrumental to the state, to those who are in power. So they perceive that institutions are doing, or at least are capable of doing, whatever powerful actors are asking them to do. And because of that, they have very little trust. When Lousewies was speaking, for instance, about those press judges, I think it is a great concept. I think that definitely Slovakia can improve in these aspects. For instance, how the justice is communicated, how it is explained, how judges make sure that their difficult choices that they are making in their work, how they weigh all the evidence for and against in those cases can be improved. But to a certain extent, the effect of it, I think, would still be limited, because if you do not have trust towards the press judge, and you think that this is somebody who is a spin doctor, which they probably will not be, as they are not in Netherlands, and I don't think that they would be in such a position in Slovakia. But if you would not trust the institutions and the person who holds the position, then it would be decreased. Of course, by doing the job very properly, very carefully, and in a, let's say, in a high quality manner, that you put, or those press judges or whoever was speaking on behalf of court would explain those choices very carefully, very cautiously, and really show how all the evidence was weighted in the decision. Probably they would be able to persuade some, but in a polarized society, that those effects are very limited. I think that maybe some of these things that might have helped Slovak judiciary would be more successful in the past. Maybe I'm just thinking about past in a much more romantic way that is appropriate. But I do have a feeling that currently we have such a polarized society that all these mechanisms would have very limited effect.
Lousewies, I was going to switch to trust to other institutions because Samuel has already opened this theme. But from my perspective, it's important to touch one more issue concerning the press judges, because as Samuel has said, the impact might be limited. But from my perspective, it's just another judge explaining the decision, and judge with limited knowledge on each case. So I guess the press judges would be a good solution for judges who are not able to communicate to public what they want to say, because it's not like everyone can communicate in the best way we can imagine. But on the other hand, the judge who has decided the case has the best knowledge on it, and the press judge would be just somehow briefed concerning the individual case. So isn't this just one of the I don't know how to say that, how to say it, because I understand that it could be a partial cure to some problems, but as Samuel said, it's just it has just a limited impact.
I agree with Samuel. I mean, I think if there's no trust to start with, then it doesn't matter how you present things. Then that's not helpful. It's just the way that it developed in the Netherlands, and it may add. I don't know if they got rid of it, whether all at once the trust would go down. I don't think it's probably not the case either, because the trust is simply there. There has been a trend, but also a call for judges just to speak more normal language. Also, the judges when they read out the verdict, because if you use very complicated language plus sentences with lots of commas and interjections and exceptions and double negatives, then people don't understand what you're talking about. And I think it's a trend that actually is kind of strengthening each other. The judges speak easier language, and then you have the press judge to explain it. But at the end of the day, if the judgments are no good, then it doesn't matter how you explain them. The underlying, product has to be there. They have to prosecute cases. They have to bring results. It has to show that a citizen has a chance against a big company, or that they prosecute corruption against powerful people. That the rule of law actually works. And I think at the end of the day, if you do that, then you don't need to communicate, because the judgments will speak for themselves. I think that's really a key thing. And I was reflecting, Samuel, because I think it's so interesting what you're saying about, historically, there has been, this mistrust of the government in Slovakia, and I've seen this in other countries as well. And I think in the Netherlands, we had a kind of an implicit social contract, and the implicit social contract, which is basically after the Second World War, but even before it traditionally is, people who are well off don't go around flaunting their riches. They give back to society, they pay their taxes. So yes, you're allowed to do well, but you don't go, lording it over people, or there has to be a lot of equality. We've always been a very egalitarian society. And what I'm concerned about in Holland right now is that implicit social contract, that if you worked hard, then you would have a pension and a house, and it would be safe, and you had a good judiciary, and you had all these things, that is starting to erode, because we've seen like an Americanization, with big companies coming in, only going after profits, the politics kind of facilitating that. And we have 3 huge cases of big polluting companies. Tata Steel is one of them, where the company was allowed to do everything and pollute, and the citizens had no chance. 3M polluting one of our river estuaries where you cannot eat the fish anymore. So, the pollution of 3M was more important than the livelihoods of the fishermen. And now Chemours, where the pollution of the company was facilitated by the local authorities, the inspection didn't work anymore, and the people can't even eat the eggs from the chickens in their backyard, and they can't drink the tap water. We have the best tap water in the world. It's outrageous. So the balance is shifting, and I think when you see more income inequality, when you see a small group of people getting richer, and at the same time the government is not giving the housing that is needed, is not, their waiting lists in the healthcare, that is starting to shift. And I think it's because Jan, maybe this is already bridged to the other institutions that you were talking about, but trust comes from people believing that democracy is there for them and that the rule of law is working. And that is it's like a garden. You have to constantly be planting and weeding and watering and keeping out the invasionary species, and sometimes the apple tree will give apples and sometimes it won't, but you can never say, oh, our tree is done. It's constant work on every single plane. And I think this is a challenge we really have, is how do you make sure that it's working on every single level? And I think we're seeing a backlash now towards too much facilitation of big companies. We've seen it in Brussels, of course, where big tech was able to mine our data of the European citizens without us even knowing about it. And you get the legal backlash with the GDPR. So you see it on many different spheres, but it's very hard to fight back on one or two aspects, because you need it takes society as a whole, and every time it goes wrong, you again erode the trust. So it has to be worked on everywhere. And I think one of the things we need to realize is that we're all part of that as well. Do we speak up when we see something? Do we have the capacity and the courage to do that? But if the leadership doesn't make this a point, then how can we expect others to do it? The tone from the top is really, really what determines it. And we have a challenge that the Prime Minister, who now is quitting finally after 10 years, he used to erase his text messages. We couldn't even check who he'd been speaking to, because he, in violation of the archive law, he would just delete stuff and then say, well, I guess nobody can see whether I spoke to these people. This kind of stuff is really bad for the trust that people have in the system. But luckily there's still enough there to go around. But I think in Holland we're also starting to realize, it's there still to a large extent, and definitely in some of the institutions, but in politics it's very low. It has already run off on a couple of horses.
As time is limited, I would like to once more encourage our visitors or guests to ask questions if you want through the chat. And I would like to move to the topic that it was discussed here, and it's politics and its impact on judiciary, because obviously, Samuel, you have already said that the polarization and fragmentation of our society as it has never been before. So is there anything that we as a civil society can do about this? Because my observation is that if you try to do something, you are just on one side or on the other side, and it's not possible to get in the middle and to find some common sense, as it used to be called, and to find something that connects us. So obviously politics and has a really great impact on trust in each institutions and in judiciary as well. So if there is some case and politicians say that it was corrupted, it's like a monster case from communist regime, and it's politically manipulated, obviously there is a large amount of people who trust in this kind of politics that they won't trust in judiciary afterwards. So what's the solution?
I have no idea. to be honest, I am currently very skeptical about the Slovak society. I'm not really sure what needs to happen for Slovak society to have this compromise that, for instance, Dutch society had, or for instance, Swedish society had some 120 years ago, that really created some kind of social contract, social consensus on where we as a country want to head, what is the direction that we want to go in, what are going to be some core values of the society. I think that Slovakia from the beginning was not really certain about the purpose of its existence other than being independent, which is a problem for let's say those first 10-15 years. Slovakia was as a society was to a certain extent tied together with the idea of European integration, which promised some better tomorrows. Unfortunately, what happened is that in the last 15 years, Europe has faced unprecedented crises in a very short time span, from economic crisis to immigration crisis to COVID, now to war in Ukraine, which just diminished the possibility of these Eastern societies to catch up with the West. And when Lousewies said that in democracy, people need to believe that democracy is there for them, that is a wonderful idea. And for some time, I had this hypothesis in my head that I think that the reason why we observe lower support for democracy across all democratic countries across the globe, at least it is reported, at least in the last 7-10 years, is that people do not perceive the possibility of moving socially upwards, which is diminishing their support for democracy. And I know that I'm digressing from the question that you are asking, but this is to make a larger point that really societies are divided, and they are divided because to some extent it is easier. It is much easier to root for. When you are watching a football match, it's much easier to root for the team that you want to root for than to root for the better one, or just to root for the football itself. This is what people do. I am noticing this, but this has been the case ever since I started in Transparency International, which was 10 years ago, that for some people, we were the authority that they would be willing to listen to. For some people, we were the opposite of authority, or somebody who they in principle disagreed with. What needs to happen is, I think that we need to see some results in the outside world that the country is improving, which has not been the case for quite some time. And that would give people the idea that this is something that we can just stand behind. This is something that where we will trust people who are, let's say, owners of this progress, that we would see progress without ideological any baggage, I want to say, but just let's say economic progress and progress in the ability of perceived social mobility. And this is something that might depolarize the society, and that might persuade at least some of the people that they do not necessarily need to stand with their camp or the other. For non-governmental organizations, I don't think that non-governmental organizations or anybody should actually fall into this narrative that I'm saying, that I think that is true, but I think that non-governmental organizations, media, and institutions in general should just do their job, explain their choices, be very human in how they present what they are doing. That means explaining the choices that we all are making and why we are coming to conclusions that we are coming to. And based on that, some people who will eventually give it some time to listen and to think about why people are saying what they are saying, they might listen to reason. But this is what is required. I think that it will take a lot of time. When I was working in TI, I know that it is very difficult to explain to general people who disagree with you why you are stating what you are stating. But I think that now the time requires to pay much more attention to it and just be very patient, do do our 100%, and maybe it will lead to something. I don't think that there is any shortcut. I don't think that there is some X factor or some unique event that might happen that will bring people together and that will give just power to the facts and power to the reason. I think it will take a long time and requires not to fall into the fallacy that there are easy solutions and that there are shortcuts and that we can resolve everything with just something magical that would happen and, well, everybody will live happily ever after. I think that it requires just hard work.
This is interesting from my point of view, because it's always said that if there is a catastrophe, there is war or everything like this, the community gets together, because everyone understands that without support of other people, he won't survive. But yeah, as we can see it from our experience from last years, we can see that it lasts for a few weeks, but afterwards it's even greater polarization in the society if we see that we won't die at streets at once or something like this. But anyways, both of you mentioned the role of media in the free society or democratic society, and when we speak about distrust and polarization, from my point of view, this is another topic which is really closely connected to what we are speaking about. And it's that even in Slovakia, there is a huge problem with polarization also in media, because let's call them mainstream media. They have their own true or the ideological background that we can see in their narratives. And on the other side, there is so-called alternative media, which is increasingly popular among the other camp, as Samuel said. So here in Slovakia, this is another factor for the polarization of society. Is it so in Netherlands as well? For instance, is the disinformation the big problem as here? And if it's so, how can you fight against it?
Right. Yes, disinformation is definitely an issue to such an extent that the government is trying to look at ways in which you can actually counter it. And it's interesting because one of my, I would say, other passions is the whole digitalization. What does it do with society? And of course, the tendency of, and we see this in the European Union as well, of when you get disinformation is to counter it with the correct information. But that, of course, is never going to work, because that just becomes terribly polarized, and then you wonder, well, what kind of things do you actually, take down from the internet? Of course, there's always things which are obvious, like terrorist context and, child pornography, that everybody agrees on. But there's, stuff, if people say, Jesus saves you, a lot of people say, well, that's nonsense and disinformation. And they say, well, actually, it's a deep held belief. So what do you do with that? But the interesting thing about disinformation, we find, is that we are trying to equip, especially the younger generation, with seeing how trolls operate. So, like, when you see, especially social media accounts that have been just set up, who constantly repeat each other, things like that, so that you actually, on the technical data, you can identify that you're dealing with a disinformation campaign, rather than people who simply believe something different than you do. And that can be an important one. I think this a group of people who never believe anything, it's going to be a very hard one to actually deal with. I don't think enough has been investigated into why do people completely disconnect from society, from believing things, from entering groups that are very polarized. Of course, the US, as usual, was the front runner in this, which of course ended in the assault on the Capitol, with people who were so disconnected from they wouldn't even believe the results of the elections anymore. It's quite a serious, violent development. So it's something that I think we should all be concerned about. And to go back, because I was very much triggered by Samuel, what you said, and Jan, your question, like, how do we deal with this, and also what can the narrative be that will bring people on board? I think that we have to admit that we live in really scary times. You know, Europe is no longer the center of the world. We see the rise of China. You see still the kind of the last throes of the American empire, who especially with their military and political might are still there. So we have to really ask ourselves, well, what is Europe all about? And I think we also have to realize that we cannot tackle any of these problems alone, whether it's the migrant flows, whether it's, you know, the Russian invasion, whether it's the energy crisis, whether it's dealing with power of big companies. None of that, small countries like yours, like mine, we can do that alone. So how do we kind of, you know, work together to try to brace ourselves? And I think it comes from having certain kind of values. And of course, values are political, because and in my own country, the more American of, like, you know, businesses before everything and making money at the expense of people's health and whatever has also been too dominant. But I think if you come with a vision of, well, what do we stand for? Transparency, accountability, human rights, but also things like, I say this to my American friends, maternity and paternity leave, paid vacations, you know, trade unions. You know, you have some kind of chance as the individual against a powerful political system, against a powerful economic system, that there's more of a balance in society that keeps us healthy. And what I always believe in, and this is how I try to say, optimistic, but Samuel, I do share your, you know, your a lot of your concerns. I'm not I don't want to be not, you know, sound naive, but that it's that I think that at the end of the day, this is what people want. People want to have open and fair societies. They want to have societies in which they can trust each other, and the question is, how do we mobilize that? And 20 years ago, I kind of was a young idealist, and I went into politics, and I did that for 15 years. And it was actually a lot of fun. And I see a lot of, you know, younger people on this call. And I don't know what it's like to enter Slovak politics, but I think if enough, you know, people do this and say, we're going to do this differently. We have seen such a rise of different political movements. And how come the fascists and extremists and Islamophobes only get to organize themselves and enter politics? You know, where are the kind of the young progressives? You know, we have the Volt, the European Party, which entered Dutch politics. We have now a farmers movement. I don't agree with their policies, but, you know, it's interesting that they came out of nowhere. We have a guy who wants to form a new social contract, who's doing very well in the polls, who's running on a mandate very much of transparency and accountability of government. So I do think that politics is the way to go, and it's not for everyone, obviously. I mean, wouldn't it be great if, you know, transparency could have their own party and then, you know, take over parliament and then change politics from the inside? But there should be, you know, we cooperate with almost all political parties that want to. Obviously, and you know, teaching them or explaining to them they can do both the right thing and then still, you know, win the elections. That seems to be the way to go. And sometimes we need a scandal in order to encourage them to do the right thing. But I do believe that working closely with people that want a positive change, and they're everywhere. They're in politics, they're in government, they're in business, and I think we are with a lot more than we believe we are. And I think, you know, I mean, I follow some of the stuff you guys do, you know, and Transparency Slovakia, and it's impressive. You know, the way you speak out, the way you stand up, and I'm sure it encourages a lot of people to say, oh, damn, of course their things can be different and can be better. So, you know, who was it, Jan, was you said we give it our 100%? I mean, I think that's what all that we can keep doing, and inspire more people to join us, and to make sure that people who want to do the right thing and who want a society built on trust and integrity don't feel alone when they do that, because we are with many, and I think we can make a difference.
Thank you very much. We are almost out of the time, but we have less than last 10 minutes, and there is one question in the chat. So I will use this opportunity to ask this question to both of you in the remaining time. From Francois, he's asking, we know the differences between countries linked to the past, but what seems common is erosion of trust towards democracy or political elites across Europe, which goes with our values, such as transparency, being openly challenged. Another issue is the fact that our societies are splitting apart on the core issues, climate, Europe, migration, etc. How can we promote our values rather than defending them? And what would you recommend that we do for next June EU elections. Please do not tell your favorites for the elections and or your preferences. And I will start with Samuel.
His sound is still off, Samuel.
Thank you very much. Great question, a difficult one. To be honest, I don't know. I think that, and when I was thinking about what Lousewies was talking about people going to politics, I think that in some societies, and maybe this is the case across developed world, that we consider the democracy to be fairly consolidated, that did not require our help, that we somewhat forgot to protect it and to still fight for it. And I think that this is what we are seeing right now, because I think honestly that currently in Slovakia there is the best political offer there has ever been in the past. But on the other hand, it is happening in a crazy political landscape that just makes facts and political programs less important. So I think that once again, what we can do first, I don't think that there is much difference between promoting and defending something. This is just, I think, a matter of narrative in international relations. This would be offensive and defensive realism, but still realism. So there is some zero-sum game with regard to values in the society. I think that what we can do is to try to explain what are the important topics, perhaps not insist on them, but explain why they are important, try to support the arguments with data and with facts, which may not necessarily work because there is some group of people who do not believe anything that is true. And I just attended a political science conference, and I saw in some of the researches that there is a group of people across Europe who just wants to see the world burn, which I think is new and is very terrifying. That group is not extremely large, but it is substantive. But I think what can be done is to just explain, be very patient, and do not work with any facts or any arguments as axiomatic truths, but always try to explain them. If people will not listen to reason, well, I don't think there is much that can be done, or to the facts. And there will be a group of people who will not listen to the reason. But I think that the debate across the world, and I think United States was once again one of the first countries that did this, that they abstained from the substantive discussion and focused on the discussion with just buzzwords and what needs to be done and what is important and what is not, without the willingness to explain why it is important and what are the facts behind climate change, what are the facts behind threats to democracy, threats to, well, anything, what we know in the current world. And I think that we need to go back and to explain and to argue in a very civilized and rational and reasonable manner. And that is all we can do, and hope for the best. That is for me.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Lousewies?
Yeah, I see the time ticking by, so I'm going to keep it quite brief. You know, in Holland, we're a little bit less polite than you guys, and we say things very directly. And I think one of the things that that people need to realize is that the reason there's no trust in political elites is because the political elites have failed us. Because when you look at the big crises, they kept on trying. They just didn't deal with them the way they should have. And I think it's really important to be honest about how big the challenges are that we are facing, how ill-equipped some of the people are in dealing with them. And you know, we have the main road out of the city of The Hague, where I live, is blockaded every day by Extinction Rebellion. And people are pissed off because, you know, they can't drive their cars and there's traffic jams. But I think, you know, Extinction Rebellion are completely right. You know, all the time we are coddling big oil and gas firms. We're giving them subsidies. You know, the IMF and those guys are no pussies. You know, have calculated, you know, billions a day go to the fossil fuel in subsidies. You know, we are subsidizing the guys that are burning our planet. Some things are fundamentally wrong with the way that we've organized our societies at the global level, at European level, and at the national and at the local level. So people are right to be upset. People are right to be angry. And I think that's an important one. But then let's take that anger, which a lot of the anger comes from fear, which I understand as well. There's a lot to be afraid of. But let's see if we can move that to action. And I think that's really, really the challenge, to get people to, rather than just staying angry and being against things or giving up and being defeatist, is to see if we can channel some of that anger into action, which is both empowering and which will lead to the kind of change. And that's a complicated call. It takes a certain kind of narrative and a certain kind of optimism, which I do see here, you know, with you guys as well. And I think we can do it, and we have to do it, because there's really no other option. Because otherwise, you know, what are we going to do? Just resign? You know, resign ourselves to a world which is falling apart and in which no one is willing to fight for the right thing. That's not a world I want to live in. So I think we should keep on working together for that better world.
So thank you very much once more for this fruitful discussion. I would like to say my thanks to Lousewies van der Laan from TI Netherlands, Executive Director, and Samuel Spáč from Comenius University in Bratislava, and also Chairman of the Board of Directors at Transparency International Slovakia. So thank you very much for this discussion, and I hope that we can find some new forum to see each other and to discuss it more deeply, where we can see some progress in the topic we have shared. So thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, and good luck with all the great work you guys do.